I am Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. Gold, fabulous gold. The price keeps going higher. Well, as these markets, finance, and scandals continue to evolve, price of gold keeps going higher. Let's bring in political analyst Stacy Herbert.
Max, gold is going up because of strife in the global economy. Nobody trusts the central bankers anymore. Check out this first headline. Cement mixer rams Irish Parliament in bank protest. A cement mixer has rammed into the gates of the Irish Parliament in apparent protest at the country's catastrophically expensive bank bailout.
Right. Well, remember Ireland was the first in to impose the austerity measures. And the government said, hey, we're going to bite the bullet on this and we're going to impose austerity measures. Little did they know that banks like Anglo-Irish was sitting on huge amounts of debt that they refused to disclose, otherwise known as malfeasance, otherwise known as financial terrorism, otherwise known as lying. Someone should beat them with a shillelagh stick until they start telling the truth.
Well, in fact, Anglo-Irish Bank owes 72 billion euros, which is the equivalent of about $97 billion to depositors worldwide, and the Irish taxpayer is on the hook for that. Now, that's most of the bank bailout in Ireland. And, of course, the cement mixer has emblazoned on it, as you can see from the photo, Toxic Bank Anglo.
I think it's an interesting idea. It's full of cement. How about some cement shoes?
The next headline, Error and Trial. World leader indicted for role in financial crisis. First case of its kind. This is the people of Iceland. Yes, they've indicted former Iceland Prime Minister Gerhard.
I told those people in Iceland. Brigitte Jónsdóttir. She's a parliamentarian up there. I told her, you got to take these guys down to the, prison and do what you'd have to do.
He faces 2 years if found guilty. And, one of his accomplices in this is Fred Mishkin, a former member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve Bank in America. And he went there in, 2006 or something like that. And he told them that their system was great. The deregulation of the banking system here was fantastic. It was the best in the whole world. So this is what happens to people who listen to, people on boards of governors of banks, central banks around the world. Savers told to stop moaning and start spending. This is Charlie Bean, who is a senior Bank of England official, and he was interviewed on Channel 4, and he said, quote, it may make sense for them to eat into their capital a bit. Well, you can't have capital without capitalism, of course. So he's saying we should destroy capitalism.
Yeah.
And then, the Channel 4 presenter goes on to show very vividly the costs of these low interest rates.
Borrowers, as a mass, have gained by £26 billion because of those interest rate reductions, but savers have lost by £20 billion. That's a direct transfer from savers to borrowers.
Yeah, but these very central bank governors are telling everybody around the world, they bleat the word socialism. We don't want socialism. We don't want socialism. But here we have evidence of them committing redistribution of wealth from savers to debtors. So this final clip here of Charlie Bean.
So actually this disincentive, this bad news for savers is it's the point of what you're doing.
It is indeed, or it's part of the point. It's not a side effect. It is actually how monetary policy works.
Why do they victimize the savers? Why? I mean, the savers are the backbone of capitalism. No capital without savings. So what planet is this guy from? What is he talking about? He's not talking about capitalism. He's not even talking about socialism. He's just stealing money. He's just stealing money. Who is this, Charlie Bean? Get him on the phone right now. Get Charlie Bean on the phone right now. The guy is... you are an idiot! Charlie Bean, you're an idiot! Okay? There's no capital there because you stole it! I mean, at least when somebody robs a bank, they don't go to the bank the next day and say, give me some money, man. And what? You just stole it the day before. We don't got no money. Charlie Bean, you've got beans in your head. I mean, I can't believe these people are in government.
Well, he's not in the government. He's in the central bank, which is above and beyond governments, actually. They control what governments do. So he admits this is what monetary policy is meant to do. It's meant to destroy capital. Now let's look at the next headline, which is his co-worker, Adam Posen. Gold spikes after BOE's Posen demands more QE, wants to buy corporate debt.
Yeah.
So gold soared on this guy speaking. And Zero Hedge has a whole list of the ticker tape coming through on Bloomberg screen. Posen, I think further monetary easing should be undertaken in UK, subject to debate. If QE does not work, then time for further fiscal stimulus, corporate debt purchases, and on and on and on. More money printing.
Yeah. Well, the gold vigilantes, of which I am one, we're going to put these guys out of business. And the gold vigilantes, as we talk about on this show, central banks are now buying gold. You've been listening to me around the world, Asia, Europe, America, some Americans, some of the smart Americans, the lucky Americans.
We have been telling people to buy gold, and we did play last week Charlie Munger, who is, the 230th richest man in America. We showed him speaking before a university admission crowd of students. And here's another clip from that, where he was asked whether or not he owns gold. And he says, I have no interest in gold. And then he says this.
If you're capable of understanding the world, you have a moral obligation to become rational. And I don't see how you become rational hoarding gold. Even if it works, you're a jerk. So I advise you to get concerned with equities.
Charlie Munger, he's an equities pimp, okay? He's down there in Omaha, Nebraska in his pink Cadillac and his big furry hat. And he's walking around Omaha with Warren Buffett on a leash and a spiked dog collar. And they're like, hey, y'all, we want you to buy equities and bail us out of our bad stock positions. Don't buy gold. That's for chumps. Okay? Now, prostitution is illegal in that state. That guy should be in a cell right now with a bunch of very horny equity people who've been abused by his equity selections.
Charlie Munger is telling the ordinary person, the one victimized by the central bankers who are destroying their currency, destroying their savings, destroying their capital, their ability to form capital, their ability to form wealth. And then we go to CNBC Europe, where they interview a banker from Cazenove Bank, and this is what he has to say about when asked why, wow, the S&P and the Dow are doing so amazing this year. It's like their best year since 1939. How do you explain this? And this is what he says.
I think one of the reasons is what are called permanent open market operations, POMO. You're going to read more about those initials. What happens is the Fed buys treasuries off the banks, pushing the money into the banks put the money into the market. They do about $6 billion per day when they do this. I think today is one of those days. And what happens is that amount of money turns the algorithms up. Then all the algorithmic trading hits the market. Real live human investment managers are not doing this buying. They know that after the rally that we've had, we're now back to where we were first in 1998, i.e. equities are for losers.
Yeah, that's right, the abattoir of Charlie Munger's abattoir equities market, where they're herding the sheep in there, the average stock buyer, to slaughter them. I mean, I was working on Wall Street, we said, shear, don't slaughter, because you wanted to rip these people off, the next day. But Charlie Munger and his equity cult, and they are a cult, and they should also be outlawed around the world as a cult and a sect. He wants people not to just shear them. He wants to slaughter them.
Well, you might also want to look at this story and ask, why is the government trying to encourage you to get into the equities markets? And remember, governments are bankrupt. They're bankrupt around the world. And they want you in there because they're the other side of the trade. They want to take your money. That's what markets are designed to do, is the other side to take your money. So that's what they're trying to draw people's savings, whatever remains of it, into the markets so they can steal it.
Well, as the CNBC guy explains, the market is no longer run by people buying and selling and the result being, the price. What we see are computers run by governments, and they're stealing. They're using the market as a facade to steal. Okay, when you go in the casino, when you walk in, it looks kind of normal, but then you walk out, you have no more money. The facade is such. Okay, there's Charlie Munger showing a little thigh as you walk into the casino. He's wearing his little strap on. Hi, I'm Charlie Munger. Come into my equities casino. Okay, and he's 86 years old, but a lot of people are into that kind of thing. And he rips you off blind. And him and Warren Buffett's laughing, ha, 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 ha. These guys, again, if Obama had a spine, which, of course, he doesn't, but if he did, he'd put him in jail.
After a trial, of course.
No, he's an enemy combatant. There's no trial, military tribunal. You take them down to the military tribunal, and all those guys got wiped out by prostitutes like Charlie Munger and the pimps like Warren Buffett, and they throw them in jail immediately. There would be no trial. I mean, this is the problem. You see, the problem is that gold is going sky high because these crooks are running the system. That's why gold is going higher, because crooks are running the system. The moment that gold starts to go down, you'll know that maybe the crooks are going to jail. But unlike the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, where over 1,000 bankers went to jail, over 1,000 bankers went to jail. How many bankers have gone to jail as a result of this crisis? Nada! That's why gold is going so high, my friends. If you want to get a play on the entire global economy being run by charlatans and I've run out of adjectives for this guy, lunatics like Charlie Munger, you got to buy gold. Is that it?
That's
Is that all
Max.
we're talking about?
That's it.
All right. The great thing about this gold coin is that it's also 100% edible. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report, Stacy Herbert.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. As soon as I finish this gold coin, we're going to be talking to some fantastic guests about lots of interesting stuff. So stay right there.
Every month we give you the future. We help you understand how we'll get there and what tomorrow will bring. The best in science and technology from across Russia and around the world. Join us for Technology Update on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to Chile to talk with Gonzalo Lira, an author and filmmaker who is shaking up the financial blogosphere with his gripping writing on hyperinflation. Gonzalo, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Max, it's a pleasure being on your show. Thank you for having me.
All right, Gonzalo Lira, the U.S. is in the grip of deflation. So how do we get from that to hyperinflation?
The problem that we're currently having is that the Treasury bond market is incredibly weak. And everybody knows this. Everybody realizes that toxic assets were replaced by Treasury bonds. And the same structural weaknesses that were in toxic assets are now in Treasury bonds. So at some point, everybody's going to realize that we cannot, that the U.S. federal government cannot pay back its debt. And when that realization happens, I think that there's going to be a panic in the Treasury bond market, and money will flee from Treasuries, which have been the traditional safe haven. Now, if people flee from what is the traditional safe haven, which are Treasury bonds, and go to commodities, commodities would shoot up, and eventually that would be reflected in prices. CPI numbers would shoot up as the price of oil went up, the price of wheat, sugar, cotton, copper. And as consumer price numbers started to rise, we would see a similar price spiral as we saw after the 79 oil shock.
Let's look at the last few years here and work out some of these terms. Now, going back to 2007, 2008, after 25 years of building credit up in the system, from going in the early part of the cycle in the early 80s, where it took $1 or $1.50 of debt to create $1 of GDP, to the point where it took $5 or $6 of new debt to create $1 of GDP. And all that debt accumulating in the system. And then in 2007, Chuck Prince over there at Citicorp said, as long as the music's still going, we're going to keep dancing. That was the top of the cycle. Then you started to go down the deflationary skids. Banks at that point, central banks, threw tons of money at the system. And people were saying, aha, this is going to cause inflation. But it did not cause inflation because even though they threw a couple of trillion at it, there were many more trillions of debt yet to be revealed. And this cycle started up where central banks kept taking more and more and more of the toxic debt from these banks and swapping them for T-bills. And this process kept stoking really the process of deflation. As a result of this, you had this move paradoxically into U.S. dollars and into U.S. Treasury bonds, which is exactly what the inflationists got completely wrong. But now we're at the point in the cycle where there's another turning point. they've all these, in the U.S., for example, the Federal Reserve Bank is sitting on so much toxic debt that what you're suggesting is that the global investment community and global bankers around the world, but primarily the investment community, says, you know what, I'm not going to own, I want to get out of my U.S. treasuries and out of my U.S. dollars, and this, of course, would be a situation of hyperinflation, otherwise known as a currency collapse. And as you write, in Chile, when you were in Chile, you had a similar experience in the early 1970s, right there in that country, which you are now drawing a parallel with the U.S. in the late 70s as well.
Yeah, you're fair until the point about Chile's brush with hyperinflation in the early 70s, which the causes of which were vastly different from the United States today. But essentially, I would argue, yeah, your analysis is you can look at this problem from various different angles. Now, number one, there is no question that there is deflation going on now in the United States, and that the Federal Reserve Board is terrified of it, and they've been throwing money, as you correctly say, because they want to prop up the economy with liquidity. Ever since Easy Al took over as Al Greenspan, took over the Federal Reserve chairman in 1987, liquidity has been the only tool that the Fed really uses. And they always add liquidity. They very rarely take it away, or they take it away incrementally. They don't believe in shock therapy in terms of, putting the brakes on the economy. They only believe in goosing along the economy, or they believe so during the entire tenure of Alan Greenspan and so far in the tenure of Ben Bernanke. So they're sort of like locked into a specific mindset that the only way to fix the situation is by throwing money at it. But, eventually this money has to be paid somehow.
But the money they're throwing at it is going into a black hole. Because the banks, for example, every single day, for example, in Ireland, the big Irish bank just said, you know what, we don't need 20 or 30 billion in bailout money. We need maybe twice that amount of money because of all the debts we failed to disclose. So there's been a failure to disclose the true nature of the debt. This is a huge issue because these banks have not told exactly how much debt they're sitting on, either because they have no idea, or my belief is that they're engaged in massive fraud. So it's impossible to know how much debt they're sitting on, but at some point they will run out of disclosing these bad debts, and at that point is the point in time when the trapdoor opens and the currency, in this case the dollar, world reserve currency, takes a bungee jump down into the canyon of oblivion.
Do you hear me contradicting you in anything that you have said? No, you do not, because you're right on the money, unfortunately. And I think that the way that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department basically has drawn out this situation in the United States was by suspending some of the FASB rules, especially Rule 157. About the accounting standards, and the banks. We all know that the banks are floating on nothing but air. I mean, there is a reason that we're calling them the American zombies.
Okay, this is basically the underlying regulatory framework for accounting. And what we're saying is the fraud being committed is a violation of this underlying accounting. Now, every time, for example, in 2008, when Hank Paulson put a gun to Congress's head and said, give us $750 billion, we're going to blow up your economy, of course, he was not complying with the law. He was not complying with FASB. He was not complying with any of the financial rules and regulations that should have been governing the banking industry. So he's saying, he's saying give us the money, even though they themselves are not complying with any of these laws. Goldman Sachs doesn't comply with FASB. Their capital on their books, it does not meet Basel minimum reserve requirement, has not met that basic minimum reserve requirement for 20 years because they abused this basic accounting law. Why can't the regulators and the President of the United States simply say, you guys are breaking the law, go to jail?
I can tell you in a very simple and rather vulgar way, because the accounting, the regulatory bodies and the political powers don't have the balls to do it. You're absolutely right. All of these people are engaged in a massive fraud. But the thing is, the people who would have the power to hold them accountable, to arrest them and try them in a jury, well, they're involved in the same fraud. And I don't think that any of these people are directly, have their hand out for some cash from Goldman Sachs, but they're all waiting for, once their terms expire, once they leave office, they'll get a nice, cushy job. I mean, look at Alan Greenspan. He's got this great job over at John Paulson's outfit. what does that tell you?
John Paulson, what's John Paulson's biggest position in his fund right now?
Gold.
Yeah. So Alan Greenspan spent his entire career bad-mouthing what?
I don't know.
Gold, basically.
I have to guess.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying he can replace gold with the U.S. dollar, which is just like gold, except it's not. And then he leaves office. He goes to John Paulson's hedge fund. Now they're buying gold aggressively. So he's not the maestro, is he? He's just another one of these, fraud peddling guys. Now let's talk about another salon monkey, Paul Krugman over there at the New York Times. He's a lazy, no good for nothing. He's saying, oh, you know what, forget it. There's nothing we can do. Let's just start a war. Isn't he? He's just saying, let's start a war to get out of our problems. I mean, is this guy, is he trying to be tried for war crimes before they even commit war crimes? What's Paul Krugman's problem?
No. He's not saying that, Max. I mean, we have to be fair to the man. He's very slippery about how he, puts his position. But he is allowing readers to draw the inference that a war would be a good thing for the American economy. He has never said so. But the way he frames his policy prescriptions in the various places that he writes, in both the New York Times and his own blog, the conclusion is inescapable that he says that he is effectively saying, although not actually or explicitly saying, that a war would be a good thing for the American economy. Now, I personally find this despicable, and I have said so. I wrote two pieces about him. One where I took apart his Labor Day weekend op-ed piece in the New York Times, where I showed how he manipulates data and information in a very slippery and very clever way that to the uninitiated or the unknowledgeable, it's hard to spot. And he uses data about debt levels during World War II and the Depression that are obviously untrue, and I write about them specifically in specific debt levels, both at federal, state, and local levels, which you can find in my blog. But the point is, the reason I'm saying this is I'm not trying to sell anything. As anybody knows, I don't advertise on my blog. I'm not trying to convince anything. I'm simply pointing out, when the emperor has no clothes.
Well, okay, you're saying through inference you can glean from his writing that he is making a conclusion through the back door of some ill-constructed argument that war would somehow be of benefit to the U.S. economy. But we don't need to go through the back door of Paul and parse Krugman's writing. All we need to do is ask ourselves one simple question. Isn't there a solution on the table to solve this problem? And it comes with a big guy attached to it, Paul Volcker. If you want to be in the capitalist business, you need capital, and if you want capital, you need savings. And the only way to attract savings is how, Gonzalo?
Interest rates. I mean, look, as I said this, in my writings, if Paul Volcker were a rock star, I'd be a screaming 15-year-old girl. He is my hero because in 1980 he raised interest rates in order to halt inflation. And notice, he raised them on an average of 464 basis points over the inflation rate, and it still took him 3 years to bring inflation to heel. I mean, once inflation gets started, which is what Bernanke and now Mr. Krugman are arguing for, of controlled moderate inflation, which is ridiculous. But anyway, once inflation gets out of the bag, it's going to be very tough to get it back, into that bag. Paul Krugman took tremendous political will and criticism at the time for his, expensive money, high interest rate solution to the inflation problem. But he recognized that a fiat currency would be destroyed by persistent double-digit inflation. Now, I don't have a problem with fiat currency. I think, frankly, it's the idea of a currency system based on actual coins or gold back, I just don't believe it. I think a fiat currency can work so long as it is well managed. Now, Mr. Volcker managed it exceedingly well, and he showed exceeding strength of character and great political will and savvy in order to maintain those high interest rates, which were necessary in the early 80s, because basically what he did was if the economy of the United States was a cancer patient, and the cancer was inflation, Mr. Volcker administered chemotherapy. Now, of course, chemotherapy is sometimes almost as bad as the cancer, but in the end, you'll get better. Now, the high interest rates that he applied led to a severe recession in the United States. That solution cannot be applied today because the economy is already so weak that if inflation starts peaking today, as it seems to be, going to be happening very, very soon, because as you know, and your audience probably knows, commodities are riding precipitously even as we speak. Gold is at 1308, sugar, cotton, copper, everything. I think that when we reach double-digit inflation and we are at the jumping-off point for hyperinflation, the Fed will realize the genie they let out of the bottle. But because the economy is so weak, they will not be able to hike up interest rates in order to stop this hyperinflation. And I think that things are going to turn very ugly, to tell you the truth.
Right. So Krugman is an academic. He's trying to argue in some logical way how to create inflation to a group of bankers that are just ignoring what he's saying and stealing the money, causing deflation until they've stolen all the money, and then you have a currency collapse or hyperinflation. So he's basically, Volcker was a guy who went to a gunfight with a gun instead of, Bernanke's going to a gunfight with a knife. He's not going to win. All right. So Gonzalo Lira, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you so much for having me on, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
All righty, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert. And I want to thank my guest, Gonzalo Lira. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying goodbye, y'all.